CTBK gives executives and owners of mid-market businesses unparalleled confidence and clarity so you can focus on strategic objectives and organizational success. Their multidisciplinary advisors, accountants, and team members have a wealth of experience and are all available and responsive to each client to ensure the most effective advice, actions, and outcomes no matter the situation or complexity level. That experience base and one-team approach, combined with integrated and efficient way of operating, enable them to be truly proactive partners, doing the best thing for their client every time. Visit ctbk.com or call 716-630-2400 to learn how CTBK can work for you.
Who's in the NFL here? You? You? How about you, Tim? You, Tim.
It's Tim Graham and Friends, brought to you by CTBK, CPAs and Business Consultants. I'm Tim Graham of The Athletic, here with Jonah Bronstein of the New Bronstein Times and of the prestigious Blue Ribbon panel that helped me select the 25 greatest games in Ralph Wilson Stadium history. That story published at The Athletic this morning. It's getting a lot of discussion among fans and the panel itself. I'm hearing from a lot of the guys today. And Jonah, thanks for taking part of that. We're going to get into that a little bit later in the podcast. You know, I'm
going to have to update my LinkedIn and my resume. I think this is the first time my name's ever appeared in the New York Times.
Is that right? I guess that stands to reason. I don't know that my name ever appeared in the New York Times until I was writing for The Athletic. Not even then. The Athletic had to be bought by the New York Times, and then maybe.
Mr. Graham, it never appeared that way?
No, it never did. Thankfully, because that could have been a bad story. You know, like Mr. Regas being let out of the federal courthouse in handcuffs. Mr. Gacy, you know, there's all kinds of ways that you could have your name appear in the New York Times.
Mrs. Bobbitt.
Right. Mr. Bobbitt. I was trying to come up with who's the parents who were suspected, the girl who was in the beauty pageants, the famous, death that was never solved.
Oh, Ramsey.
Yeah. Mr. Ramsey. That's what I was trying to come up with. Mr. Simpson. We're going to talk about the 25 greatest games, the panel. I was thrilled to be able to put that panel together. I did not vote in it. I just cobbled it and amassed everybody's votes. And I was thrilled that everybody agreed to do it. It was nice to be able to get Mark Gaughan to do it, fresh off of his tenure at the Buffalo News. We're, I guess, no longer competitors. I was able to ask and lean into Mark Gaughan's expertise on this. And we can give the whole, I thought it was a pretty good panel in terms of eras. You know, we had Greg Tranter from the Buffalo History Museum and Bud Bailey and Chuck Pollock, who covered all those games in the 70s. Chuck Pollock was there when he covered the very first game at what was then Rich Stadium. Anyway, we'll get into all the nuance, and we'll get as granular as Jonah and I can take it. But it was great to have Jonah on the panel. Jonah was a bit avant-garde with a couple of his picks that actually made a difference in the voting in a good way, I thought, because some games I left it up for everybody to determine what their definition of greatest was. What is greatness? And does that mean the Bills have to win? Well, that was up to the panel, each individual. Does that mean the stakes have to be high? Not necessarily. Does it mean a record has to be broken, or what's something unique or whatever? It was up to everybody. And it was, I think the 9 panelists was a lot, but it offered for a very healthy discussion on all these games. A total of 62 games received at least a vote. So this was not just something where everybody was, it's not like we hit 25. We were struggling to hit 25 games. I could have gone to 30 or 35 games, but it was starting to peter out a little bit. But I think down around the 25th, the game that came in 25th, in fact, I happen to have it here in front of me, got 6 votes and one of them was as high as 15. We had a 15 and a 17 and a 19. Oh, and a 16. In fact, all right, so the game that came in 25th received 6 votes, and the lowest it came in was 21st on Mark Gaughan's ballot. So that's how, I mean, that's a lot of votes. That's a healthy discussion.
Mhm. I'm going to bring this up later, but I think there's a game. It was probably my 25th one, and I maybe would have put it higher, but I wonder if I'm the only one that voted for it because I don't think it got much attention in some of the discussions we
Okay.
had about it. But
I
I'll bring that up
have all
later.
my pages here, all my different, there's a lot. I don't know. I can't remember how many games were on I mean, these are just bullet points. These are just thumbnails on each game. All right, we'll take a look. We'll go digging. We'll go digging. But let's talk about real quick. I mean, we're going to talk about the Bills' greatest games. Also, before we get to the Bills roster, practice squad, our thoughts on moves that were made, guys who made the 53, guys who didn't make the practice squad. And I think we've talked about it before. We talk so often that sometimes I can't recall if we've had this discussion on the podcast or not. But I think this year I'm going to not call it Highmark Stadium a lot of the time because we're dealing with 2 Highmark stadiums. And when I'm writing a story and you're talking about the Highmark Stadium that the Bills are currently playing in and the Highmark Stadium that's being built across the street, and it is the last season. The Bills have a patch in the whole thing, the farewell season of the current stadium. I'm going to just start calling it old names. I'm going to call it the Ralph. I'm going to call it Rich Stadium in a story. And not just to be quirky, but sometimes you need to differentiate. Like back when it used to be called Buffalo Bills Stadium, I hated that because as a reporter, and especially you, Jonah, like having to write for the Associated Press where you have to do it by certain protocols, to say that the Buffalo Bills beat the Miami Dolphins in Buffalo Bills Stadium is one of the clunkiest sentences you can come up with.
Well, I would call it by its original name, and this cannot apply to the new stadium, and that's Erie County Stadium. Before they sold the naming rights, that was the name,
Right?
and the new stadium won't be owned and operated by the county the way this stadium is. So maybe that's historically the most accurate name. I'll ask you this: what do you think as
Orchard Park
time?
Stadium too. It was called in some of the materials because
Okay.
they didn't know what to call it.
As time goes along, what will be the name that we refer to the old stadium as in its history?
The Ralph.
Yeah, I disagree with that. I understand why. I think that rolls off the tongue in a very good way and is an acceptable name. But I would call it Rich Stadium because that was the original name. And in the 52 years of the stadium, the most number of years it had that name. I think it was a 30-year deal. So the first, there 60% of the stadium history had that name.
I'll disagree with that. So I agree. Okay, so that's what it should be called. And I'm big on whatever it was first is what it should be. I mean, it's as teams, like the Superdome. I'll never call it the Mercedes-Benz Superdome. It's the Superdome. I don't say MetLife Stadium in a story. It's always the Meadowlands, which is actually convenient. Meadowlands is just the place it is. And you know what that is. I don't need to explain what the Meadowlands is to a reader. But MetLife Stadium or any stadium you're reading, how many times do you get to a place and you have to stop and think, now, which one is that? Especially if there's no dateline on a story, a basketball arena, a hockey arena, and you're like, which one? Sometimes there's two. There are two.
Yeah.
There's the Mercedes-Benz Dome in Atlanta and the Mercedes-Benz Superdome in New Orleans. Um,
Yeah, it's confusing. Like Staples Center in Los Angeles is now the crypto arena, and it makes you think there's a new arena. They built a brand new one. You get confused.
yes. Or Scotiabank, I think, has its name on a bunch of arenas up in Canada. So, anyways, um, there was a point I was going to make. What was it?
That
Oh,
you
Rich
believe it
Stadium.
should be
I
called the
don't
Ralph.
think it will be known, or so I agree that that's probably what it should be known as, but it won't stick because it's been worked out of our systems already. And people have gone on to call it so many different things that you also have a fan base that's aged out, that's younger, that don't, there's probably fans in their late 20s, early 30s that if you said Rich Stadium, like they'd probably know, but that's not what they know it as. I think the Ralph, it also will be a throwback to the previous time, the previous era of Bills football, the Ralph. And
I have a quibble with calling it Ralph Wilson Stadium
well, the
because,
Ralph is different though, right? The Ralph.
well, yes, the Ralph sounds great, and especially when high school teams would make it there, it was always going to the Ralph, and that just sounded and felt great. I believe it was maybe going to the Rich before that, but now going to the Highmark. I don't think that's what the kids say these days. But if Ralph Wilson Stadium was the name of the stadium because it was built and named to honor Ralph Wilson and his history with the Bills and forming the franchise and putting the team in Buffalo and keeping the team in Buffalo, I think that would be wonderful. And his statue is outside the stadium, and maybe that, should be factored into it. But the way I believe and perceive it, I'm not really reporting this as a fact, but I think there's truth to this, is that when it was named Ralph Wilson Stadium in 2002 or 2003, whenever that was, it seemed to me like Ralph Wilson made that the name of the stadium because he had resented that for 30 years it was named after Bob Rich. And I think that
That's
was,
correct.
yes. And I don't like that. And I don't know if we really necessarily want to honor that in
That there
perpetuity.
was maybe too much ego involved, that he wanted his name on his own
Yeah.
stadium.
Well, naming your stadium after yourself, who else has done that?
Yeah, and look, I think that it was probably laundered to a certain point where the Bills came up with the idea to call it Ralph Wilson Stadium, but Ralph was still the owner, and he could have said, "No, let's not do that. We should call it something else."
And how
Um,
quickly we forget this era where it was called New Era Field.
New Era Field. I liked New Era Field because it's just different. It's not a stadium. I just like having a variety, and you could say I also like to be able to say, and this is really geeky, but you play in a stadium. You could, and I had this discussion with John Vogel, the copy editor par excellence. He was always, every word was measured with John Vogel, because not only as a writer but as an editor, he was. I think he enjoyed editing more than, and took a lot of pride in his editing. Maybe loved that more than even covering the Sabres, but these are the discussions that you'd have. And we've had these too.
Yeah.
You get some journalists over a couple of beers and you start talking about really dumb things, or things that no one else would have any interest in. But you play in a stadium, you play in KeyBank Center, you play in whatever. But New Era Field allowed you to say at, and then I would have the discussion: is it on? Do you play on New Era Field? And John would
Correct.
but John was a little finicky on that, and he would say absolutely not. And I was just like, well, why? You play on a field.
Well, and sometimes you have venues, I think this is more common in college, where the field has one name and the stadium has another name, or the court and the
Right.
venue have different names. And another thing I don't like,
Invesco Stadium at Mile High, or whatever the hell that
right.
was.
And another thing I don't like is that, so it was Ralph Wilson Stadium, it was Rich Stadium, but then it was New Era Field. Now it's back to Highmark Stadium, and the baseball stadium downtown was Pilot Field, and it was Coca-Cola Field, and now it's Salem Field, but there were times when it was North AmeriCare Park. And the hockey arena has been KeyBank Center, but it's also been Marine Midland Arena and such and such. I
And
think
HSBC
yeah,
Arena.
the surname should stay the same. It's an arena. You can change the naming rights, but it's always arena, or it's always center, or it's always stadium, it's always field. You keep that consistent, I think.
HSBC Arena at the cross. What did they call it?
Oh, the Crossroads.
No, it wasn't the Crossroads. Damn it.
Well, that was the original name of the arena before naming rights. So I don't think it was ever planned for that to be the permanent name, but that was the project name, Crossroads Arena.
Was it?
Because it was a crossroads site. I believe there's some Buffalo geographic history that plays into that.
God, I hate it when I flail on stuff that I'm supposed to know like this. I mean, I covered that team for so long.
Now, maybe the new stadium should be called Highmark Field to differentiate from Highmark Stadium.
Crossroads Arena. Yeah, what was originally known during construction as Crossroads Arena opened in 1996, and then it became Marine Midland Arena. Well, shit, I don't care at this point.
Crossroads
Anyways.
Arena is the only name of that site that was not named for a bank.
Right. Well, and then everybody was bought by the other. Right?
Right.
HSBC bought Marine Midland, therefore they got the naming rights, and then KeyBank bought HSBC, I believe. However, Bill's roster. Speaking of names that just get replaced all the time.
And
They
old
had to
names
cut
coming
about
back.
40 dudes, huh?
And old names coming back.
Old names coming back. That's right. Um, so the week that was on the Bills roster, they have to cut down to 53. I think there's some fans that are miffed, and they shouldn't be. And we talk about this every year. But, Frank Gore Jr. was not going to make the team. As much as you love to see him out there. And yeah, he looked great when he wasn't fumbling and when he wasn't trying to pick up a blitzing linebacker. He looked good running the ball. But Frank Gore Jr. was not going to make this team. Terrell Shavers made the team. He's one of those guys that a year or two ago was in that Frank Gore situation where he'd always look great in preseason, but just wasn't quite ready yet. Now here the Bills are with Terrell Shavers. Fans finally get their wish to see him stick after a couple of years of not making the team. Of course, he did get that cup of coffee that he turned into a long touchdown against the Jets last year, which was a lot of fun. Laviska Shenault doesn't make the team. A lot of people had high hopes for him as a return man and possibly a receiver. He's unable to beat out Brandon Codrington. But really, Jonah, unless we're talking about injuries, there was not a lot of news regarding the 53-man roster and the practice squad. And you made a great point before we hit the record button is of all the fretting that gets done and all the words that get expelled, both orally and on print, in print, sorry, John Vogel, in print, all these tough decisions that are going to be made. Oh my gosh, we're going to lose so-and-so and they're going to get picked. The Bills pretty much have all the guys they wanted to keep, right?
It seems that way. I mean, you maybe have to ask Brandon Beane off the record if there was anybody they hoped to retain on the practice squad that they were unable to. But it does feel a lot like the Bills cut down to a 70-player roster and not a 53-player roster. And all the hoopla going into it, the official projections and the live reactions and the reports all day long of who's making the team and who's not making the team seem to be a lot of not wasted breath, but not as interesting or notable or newsworthy as it was made to seem. I think roster cutdown day as a news event is overhyped, probably throughout the league, but it seems even more so here in Buffalo. And, I thought it was a lot newsier the next day when Jordan Poyer's coming back to the practice squad. And, the timing of this was a little different, but Jordan Phillips as well. I think that's more.
Reporters are happy for both of those moves. Two great talkers.
Yeah, well, now when will be the next time they talk? Because practice squad guys tend to not talk too often.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, I don't not to go down too much of a detour, but like Kareem Jackson was on the team last year, and occasionally I'd see him quoted. And even going back a couple of years ago, he was the one that had the great quote to John Worrow about Stephon Diggs taking himself out of games. And when you'd see Kareem Jackson or one of these veterans off the practice squad quoted, I sometimes kick myself and say, you kind of forget about them because they're not on the field during the games, but they are sources of wisdom. I mean, these are the types of guys that if Kareem Jackson was retired and you had his number in your cell phone, you'd be calling him up to get a comment like, hey, what do you see? But this guy's actually in the locker room and on the practice field, and he's sitting right there at his locker stall watching the world go by. He's got time. Yeah. Go talk to the guy. So I think, and with their experience and the fact that they've been around, and I think Jordan Phillips and Jordan Poyer will be talked to, unless they decide. Jordan Phillips will never turn down an interview. Jordan Poyer might be like, "Hey, I'm not playing. I don't want to talk." I can see that.
Yeah, you're right about that. They won't be giving press conferences in front of the cameras very often, although they will when they play if they're called up or they're put on the active roster and they're on the team. Even if they're not always on the active roster or active on game days, these guys are probably going to be practicing and with the club all throughout the season if they don't get injured. And Dane Jackson's also in that mix. I mean, I think that kind of got underappreciated because he was with the team in training camp. And regarding someone like Dane Jackson, I mean, why would the Bills give him one of the 53 roster spots if they knew they could release him and re-sign him on the practice squad and not need to keep them? And I think there's a handful of guys on the team that the Bills knew they would be able to get back in the practice squad and almost would be wasting a roster spot by, allowing them to make, or not allowing them, but, the idea that every roster spot is open for competition and that every day at training camp we were seeing who was claiming these spots. is overblown, because I think the Bills go into training camp with a pretty good idea. Not every team is in this position, but the Bills this season, I think, pretty much knew maybe 50 to 51 of their roster spots were pretty locked in, and they knew the guys that they were going to be able to release and bring back on the practice squad. I don't think training camp and preseason affected very many of those spots. They did a little bit. Tyrell Shavers probably did make the team with his preseason performance, but also Tyrell Shavers being a special teams contributor and proving his worth last season. I had a conversation with Ryan Talbot early in training camp, and we kind of went through an exercise of, if this was a 54-man roster, who's the 54th guy? And Tyrell Shavers was the guy we both came up to. So it wasn't a major surprise that he was the guy that made his way onto the team when an IR spot opened up.
My surprise, and it wasn't that he got cut. My surprise is that he didn't win the job from the time he was signed. And a lot of the intel that I was hearing about plans for this guy, but he was unable to win the job, is Laviska Shenault. And I mentioned him earlier. He was unable to knock Brandon Codrington out of the box as the return guy. And I thought that Shenault brought more to the table. Of course, Codrington is a liability as a defensive back. He did play, or he started and played most of the game against Chicago, did not look great. So this guy's not a cornerback. He's a return guy, whereas Shenault offered something as a receiver. Tried to see him as a punt returner, something that he's never done in the NFL, and for whatever reason, it didn't work out. He had the injury issues, but when that signing was made, and I think that the Bills expected it to be true also, is that he was the return guy. And so that's this surprise over an arc of time. Not that he got cut isn't a surprise.
But he was injured early in training camp.
Right.
He does not have the punt returning experience, which I think makes it a risk for the Bills to give him that role without seeing more of whether he's able to do that. And the Bills traded for Codrington last year, and even though they did not activate him late in the season for the playoff games, I think they believe in him as a return man and want to keep him around in that role. And if Tyrell Shavers makes the team as a sixth receiver, that reduces the need for Shenault to be another wide receiver. They don't need him to make it as the seventh receiver.
That's right. Yeah, Tyrell Shavers may have cost Shenault the job too. I mean, there is a calculus probably involved. It wasn't just straight up head to head Shenault versus Codrington. It was, hey, we can't afford to keep this extra receiver. That's absolutely true.
I think the most intrigued from cutdown day wasn't a surprise, but it was learning that Maxwell Harrison is going on injured reserve and Tre'Davious White is not. I think we expected one of them, if not both of them, might be in that position, and kind of learning how severe their injuries may be and how the Bills view their health status and readiness for the season was the big news coming out of cutdown day.
Yeah, I tried to get an update from Tre'Davious White Wednesday at practice as he was walking out of the locker room. He happened to walk right past me, and Joe Biscaglia and I both asked him if he had an update, and he just kind of laughed and said, I got to get home. Got to go play with my kids. And I'm thinking to myself, in those few words, you could have given us an update. Of course, I'm being facetious. I'm half joking. But I just think it is kind of funny. It's bemusing when athletes say, I don't have time to talk. And in that time, they could have talked. But I once got a phone call from Takeo Spikes one time. I was trying to interview him for a story, and we were on the phone for 10 minutes, and it was 10 minutes of him telling me he didn't have time to talk. And if he can maybe call me back next week. And I just had another one of those. Jan Stenerud, who was a kicker for Marv Levy in Kansas City, the Hall of Fame kicker. When I was doing my Marv Levy tribute, I wanted to get some Kansas City perspective in there too. So I reached out to Jan Stenerud, and we were on the phone for 10 minutes of him trying to set up a time for us to talk. Because he needed to have an appointment. And I kept saying, we can do it right now. And he's like, no, I don't have time. And then he wanted to ask if Coles was still there in Buffalo, because he remembered he used to go to Coles back when he was passing through town. And I'm like, can you just give me a comment on Marv? Anyways.
Did you ever try to talk to Corey Graham in the locker room when he played for the Bills?
Well, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
He's my cousin.
Much always, yeah. Well, maybe it was easier for you. He'd always say no the first time you asked him to talk, and then he'd sort of wait, and if you didn't give up, he'd say okay, and then he'd talk to you. It was just kind of a little shit test he'd give everybody.
It didn't always work, but I would say 50% of the time, that was what Marshawn Lynch wanted you to do. Now, not at his Super Bowl press conference when he says, "I'm here so I won't get fined." I mean, he wasn't going to crack that day. But yeah, he was putting you through some paces. And if you stayed with it long enough, and you had to ask maybe a fourth time, it wasn't just a second time. But most people, because Marshawn is kind of intimidating dude, he'd stare at you in a certain way. And once I pestered him enough that his shoulders slumped and he started laughing, and once I knew what the trick was, but then he also kind of resented me for going to the well a little too often. So that's where the 50% came in. If I came to him once a month with that, I think I would have batted 1,000. But if you go to him once a week, you know. How about Hard Knocks, Joan? I know we talk about it every week, but what a terrible episode. The way it's just designed, that they're talking about Frank Gore making a beeline. I know they're making a play off the spelling bee little segment that they did, but Frank Gore's making a beeline for the Bills roster. And we knew already he had been cut. He was already cut. Zach Davidson, Shane Buechele, Mike White, Casey Rogers, cut. Anybody that Eric Charlo, cut. Like anybody that they talked about got cut. It was amazing. And it was just like trying to watch the last episode of The Sopranos when you know what happens at the end. You're just like, why am I saying through this? But anyway,
I've given up on Hard Knocks. I mean, I'll probably watch the finale and maybe try to catch up on these episodes at some point between now and then. But, we're not learning anything that's newsworthy that we need to write about. And I've been more and more bored with each episode. I do think it's well done. It's well shot. It's well
it's
produced.
amazing. The cinematography is fantastic.
It's excellently crafted, but in terms of the information and the storylines, I just not all that interested. I am a little.
The one guy I just want to point out while we're on that, the one guy who didn't get brought back, who was well, Mike White didn't, because they were talking about they're not going to keep 4 quarterbacks on the practice, but Zach Davidson did not get brought back. He was somebody who was highlighted, got cut, and not re-signed to the practice squad. And I just want to bring this up because I saw it, and people talk about clickbait. People really don't know what clickbait is. Like a headline historically is clickbait. The concept of a headline, the lead of a story, is read bait. It's to get you interested in the story, to spend some time on it. So a lot of people say, oh, that headline's clickbait. When I did the story on the flag football player, Isabella Geraci, Bills fans might not have seen it, but I did this story a couple of weeks ago. It ran heading into the World Championships, flag football player based out of Cleveland, Isabella Geraci, who the administrative executive of USA Football calls her the greatest receiver in the world. And I talked to a Cleveland Browns defensive back who's done some work with Isabella Geraci, who says, I buy it, that she is. So we put greatest receiver in the world in the headline, and people are like, that's clickbait. I mean, like, yeah, but we didn't make it up. It's clickbait because that's what a headline is. Here's clickbait. Poor Zach Davidson. Yahoo Sports, through the Sporting News. Why Bills cut Zach Davidson after Shiloh Sanders' ejection? So the poor guy's got to be brought, like Shiloh Sanders. That's clickbait. They're SEOing that Zach Davidson to death. They needed to put Shiloh Sanders in the headline so you would give a shit that Zach Davidson got cut. Anyway, so that's more journalism talk. A lot of journalism talk on Tim Graham and Friends this week.
I think people like that. Or maybe they could tell us in the comments on YouTube if they don't.
They're not listening anymore, those who don't.
Perhaps.
Hey, by the way, subscribe. Put comments in the down there underneath the YouTube. Like, favorite, rate us, do all that stuff. It really helps us out with our algorithms, so that way we don't have to put Shiloh Sanders in a headline. We do it the right way. We rig it a different way.
Clickbait is the new, you're just writing that to sell newspapers, even though nobody's buying newspapers anymore, and
right.
We don't make any extra money off the newsstand sales. But that used to be that's not a story. You're just trying to sell papers. Now it's
the Atlanta Journal-Constitution had just announced yesterday that is no longer going to print papers. That's amazing. That, yeah. Atlanta's paper. This isn't like Pittsburgh's second paper or the Dubuque paper. This is a BSD.
Yeah. I saw that. I was interested to read had forgotten this was the case that they had actually made that announcement years ago, then changed their mind, but had been moving along on a path towards that they decided a couple of years ago. The publisher determined they weren't ready to make that change, but they were preparing to make that switch. I mean, unfortunately, I think this is a trend, and you're going to see more and more newspapers do that. And if the Atlanta Journal-Constitution has any financial success with this new business model, we could see a wave of many, many newspapers making this decision all around the same time.
I sidetracked you when I shoehorned my Zach Davidson point in there. You were going to talk something about the
I
Bills
think I just wanted
roster
to note that
at Hard Knocks.
I'm more interested in watching next year's Hard Knocks now than I am in watching the season finale of this Bills Hard Knocks because I want to determine for myself, is Hard Knocks just a boring show for me, or is it I'm just bored with Bills Hard Knocks? I want to see if I'm interested in these storylines when it's another team that I think the problem for you and me and maybe many Bills fans is that just about everything that is on that show we already know. We've either already seen and we've read about, or we're in our cases we're there, seeing it with our own eyes, and that you just feel like you're watching a documentary about something that already happened, and that there's some interest or there's some entertainment value in that, but you're not learning anything you didn't already know, and that makes it somewhat boring.
The Jimmy Charlo stuff was good because he came to camp late and we didn't really know his story that much, and it's a good story. I think I said Eric Charlo earlier, a little baseball brain cramp. But yeah, the Jimmy Charlo stuff was good. But also you knew he wasn't going to make the team. You didn't get
Go,
to see any behind the scenes. You didn't get to see, with the exception of Terry Pagula flubbing who number 44 is, or this just past episode where they're talking about some guys who we already knew were getting cut. They had already gotten the conversation from the Turk. You don't see Brandon Beane just talking through some things with his guys. I mean, there's all kinds of conversations that could be had that would be considered insightful that aren't giving away state secrets. And that's used to be that one of my favorite parts of Hard Knocks was the GM's office where somebody's passing through and they have a frank discussion about the third cornerback or whatever, about who's needs to step it up or who's doing great. And we didn't get to see any of that.
Maybe over time we'll learn, or reporters like yourself will uncover that there were potentially good storylines that the Bills uh, edited out of the broadcast, but that doesn't help making the episodes any good to watch now, learning what was left on the director's floor.
Joe Andreessen made the roster, not a surprise this year. And of course, a greater role. He had a pretty impressive looking training camp, even away from Hard Knocks. Hard Knocks gave him the star treatment. So, yeah, they showed a few tackles here or there that he could have made, or where he hit Ty Johnson near the sideline, almost touched off a training camp fight, little oopsies like that. But by and large was given the star treatment as a guy who's getting a bigger role and the coaches really like, and the owner can't quite remember him, but everybody else does love him and they know who Buffalo Joe is, which leads me to a guy that there's some remorse out there, I think, among some Bills fans that one got away. The next Buffalo Joe got away. Sean Dolak made the San Diego Chargers roster as an undrafted rookie, just like his predecessor at UB did before him. And you cover UB a lot, and there's another in the pipeline, maybe, that UB's turning into undrafted linebacker U, because Khalil Murdoch had 16 tackles last night against Minnesota. But what's your thought, Jonah, on Dolak, and if the Bills missed out on an NFL player there?
Well, before kind of putting it into Bills context, a great Western New York football story. Sean Dolak's not only played at University of Buffalo, but he's from West Seneca East. He walked on at UB after going to a prep school and worked his way into being a starter. There was no guarantee that he was ever going to be an effective Division I football player. He almost played college lacrosse instead of football because he wasn't being recruited at the Division I level, and turned into the nation's leading tackler and an All-American player, but was not invited to the Senior Bowl, was not invited to the Combine, wasn't drafted by the Bills, also wasn't drafted by the other 31 teams in the NFL. And for him to prove his value to the LA Rams, he did sign as a UDFA, which is different than Joe Andreessen, who had to go to the Bills rookie
Right.
minicamp tryout and get his roster spot through that means. But the Rams also drafted Chris Paul Jr. in the fifth round. And usually fifth round draft picks don't get released, and usually UDFAs at a position don't make the roster over a draft pick at the very same position. But Dolak proved his worth on special teams and on defense in the preseason and is now part of the Rams roster. And I would think probably part of the game day 47, similar to Joe Andreessen. It took a few weeks before Joe Andreessen got activated, I believe, but being a special teams contributor gets you active on game day, and we'll see if Sean Dolak is in that position with the Rams this season.
Good transition to go to Khalil Murdoch. I mentioned those 16 tackles last night. UB loses at Minnesota in its season opener last night. Covered the spread, so I guess that's a minor triumph there, but looked pretty good. I mean, the game was dull. I mean, the game was just, it was too, just slogging it out. The UB struggled to get first downs, but it was just that type of game. And I thought Minnesota, especially if you were to tell me that UB was going to have that much trouble offensively, then I think I'd tell you that it was going to be a blowout, but it wasn't. They hung in there.
Yeah, Red Murdoch is now the nation's leading tackler. Not every team has played a game yet, but of the teams that have played, his 16 tackles last night at Minnesota ranked first in the country. He was number 2 behind Sean Dolak last year. I don't know if he'll be an All-American this year, but I think he's a bit of a candidate. Athlon Sports had him as a 4th-team All-American, even though there's only 3 All-America teams. But I think he has a better chance of getting drafted than Dolak or Andreessen did. He has a chance to break Khalil Mack's tackle for loss career record, which is, I believe, the NCAA record, not just the UB record, and continuing in this lineage of great linebackers to play at UB and on their way to the NFL. He's an excellent player. ESPN rated him 90th on their list of the top 100 players in college football. He's on the preseason watch list for the Campbell Trophy and the Bronco Nagurski Trophy, things like that. He's the best player on UB's defense, a team leader.
And a great name. Sounds like a fighter pilot.
Yeah, right.
Do you know where the nickname comes from?
No, but I was thinking about that today, that I kind of wanted to ask him a little bit more about that. I do find it interesting that, I tweeted last night, he had 10 tackles in the first half and a sack and a big 4th down stop. He was the best player on the field in the first half, I think. But, I tweeted about that early in the, midway through the second quarter, and it got a lot of reaction, and some, the UB fans liked seeing that. But I got a lot of reaction from Bills fans in the context of, oh, the Bills got to draft this guy, and why didn't they draft Sean Dolak? To get back to what you asked me earlier. And yeah, it does look like maybe the Bills
because they don't need 2 Joe Andreessens.
Exactly. And I don't know if the Bills needed a linebacker in general because they didn't draft a linebacker and they didn't seem to make that position a big priority in their UDFA signings. Now, they cut at Ulofoshio, so maybe in the long run, and Balin Spector got injured and he was released, so maybe in the long run, the Bills had a little bit more of a linebacker need than they thought at the time of the draft. But I also understand that the Bills did have conversations and maybe even offered a Sean Dolak to sign after the draft, and that he chose the Rams as a better opportunity to make the team. So I don't know if this is necessarily a big whiff on the Bills' part. It would have been nice to see another local make the team and another Buffalo Joe story, but I don't know if the roster has room for 2 Buffalo Joes. And, Sean Dolak was a better college football player than Joe Andreessen at UB. Joe Andreessen played the first 4 years of his college career at FCS Bryant. But when they were on the team together, Sean Dolak was more effective as a UB player. So maybe you could have brought Sean Dolak in to compete with Joe Andreessen and see if he was better in that role. But the Bills like Joe Andreessen and what he brings, both his football ability, but I think his makeup and his character and what he is on the team. And I don't think that they necessarily needed to come in and try to upgrade from that position.
What are your thoughts on last night's game?
The UB kept it close for about 3 quarters. The defense played excellent, made some red zone stops. The offense struggled, only had about 150 total yards, and much of that came on one 40-yard touchdown pass and a 49-yard drive where they missed a field goal. They went three and out several times. They only had one first down in the first 5 series. But, on the road against a Big Ten opponent in these situations, UB's offense has generally struggled. I don't think they've had too many high scoring games against Power Five opponents over the years. They have had games like this where the defense kept them in the game and kept the score respectable, but it's not that it can't be done. MAC teams have won these games and MAC teams have scored a lot of points. Uh, and even when UB played in Minnesota a couple of years ago, they only had 7 points, but Anthony Johnson had 140 receiving yards. They moved the ball well in that game. But I don't think there's much yet to be concerned about with UB's offense, and I think you can be encouraged by how well the defense played. Would have been nice if they could have won this game, but they covered the spread. They were 15 or 16 point underdogs, and they only lost by 13 points. So that's, I guess, something to hang your hat on as a UB fan. And their schedule is going to ease up now. This is the hardest team on their schedule, not just because it's a uh, Big Ten team. They don't play any other Big Ten teams, but the Athletic they ranked all 136 teams. I think UB was 71, I believe, was the number, something around that. Toledo, another MAC team, was ranked slightly higher than them. Toledo might have been 71 and UB 73, but Toledo's not on UB's regular season schedule. They might meet in the uh, MAC championship game if both teams succeed to that point, but they're not playing in the regular season. And nobody else on UB's schedule, none of their other non-conference opponents or their conference opponents for that matter, are ranked higher than UB is. And Minnesota was the only team ranked higher than UB among their scheduled opponents. So based on that bit of data, UB could go 11-1. I don't know if that's necessarily what they're going to do, but they could potentially be favored in just about every game they play, or most of the games that they play. They play 7 home games for the first time ever in school history, 4 of the next 5, so an opportunity to get off to a good start. That one road game's at Kent State, which is the worst team in college football. So even though they lost last night, uh, this is going to be a good UB team, and I think they're going to win some games, especially in the first half of the season, and have an opportunity to contend for the MAC title and go to a bowl game and continue that limbo momentum from last year when they went 9-4 and won the last 5 games of the season.
Well, they should be 1-1 after next Saturday's game against St. Francis of PA. That's a 1AA team that is transitioning down to Division III, and they lost a lot of their players once that announcement was made that they were going to uh, throttle downward. And St. Francis lost to Louisiana Monroe last night after a lengthy lightning delay, just following that game along. And so the UB should have no trouble in Amherst against that opponent next
Yeah.
Saturday.
UB is going to
Um,
win these next 2 games by pretty big numbers. I think the most interesting thing might be trying to figure out who's better, St. Francis or Kent State. And then you're going to see
or Kent State.
the heart of UB schedule. I think, well, the MAC games determine how good your season is ultimately. But as far as record wise, then they have non-conference games at home against Troy and UConn. Comparable opponents. I don't think they're games where UB is going to be a heavy favorite in either one, but playing both of those teams at home early in the season on Saturdays when they tend to get better crowds is a good opportunity for UB. And if they can win both of those games, get to 4-1 before they return to MAC play, I think they're set up to have a really good season coming after that.
Let's talk about 25 greatest games at the Ralph / New Era Field / Rich Stadium / Buffalo Bills Stadium / Highmark Stadium. List came out today at the Athletic. I put together a panel that included, and I'll just give the rundown of everybody so we know it was alphabetical order. This is not an order of importance. So, Jonah, I don't want you to get too excited. Bud Bailey, formerly of the Buffalo News, local from Clarence High School, a historian, has written several books about Buffalo sports, and he has one coming up about the greatest games at the stadium. So it was, I didn't know that when I reached out to him as part of the panel, and he is co-authoring that with another panelist, I guess I'm not going to go in alphabetical order now. I'll bounce around. Greg Tranter of the formerly of the Buffalo History Museum, or at least he's on the board of directors there still. He used to be the president of that board. And Greg has the largest collection of Bills artifacts. It's been on display at the Buffalo History Museum for a long time. A lot of folks know Greg. He's been on the show, a friend of the show. And Chuck Pollock of the Olean Times Herald. He retired after 40 years, 50 years, whatever it was down there. He's writing the foreword to the book. And I didn't know any of this when I reached out to all three of them. So they were ready to go. Let's just say that their lists came in pretty quickly. Eric Brady, formerly of USA Today, the local boy and Canisius College grad, and the original Griffin. In fact, he's been on the show before too. He was in the costume. His dad, I believe, invented the Griffin as a mascot, and then Eric was the first one to wear the mascot uniform way back in the day. Jonah Bronstein of Bronstein Sports Plus and Tim Graham and Friends podcast. Mark Gaughan of the Buffalo News, Chris Parker, aka Bulldog from WGR, John Worrow of the Associated Press, and Lisa Wilson, former executive sports editor at the Buffalo News, who is now at The Athletic. And the late Alan Wilson was her husband. He covered the Bills for a long period of time. She used to cover the Bills, I think it was briefly, but back in her salad days when she was at the Niagara Gazette. So a lot of years that went back of people who didn't just cover, people who have covered every era, the Fitzmagic era, the Allentown era, the Drought era, the Electric Company era, you name it, we had it covered. So Jonah, I guess, well, the one thing I don't want to unveil it because I'd like people to click on it and take a look. And it's fun to see the list. It goes from 25 down to 1. And I thought it was a very tight number 1 and number 2. And that was surprising to me. I thought that one of the games, and we'll go ahead and say the 2 games. A lot of people would guess the top 4. How about this? Not in order. The top 4 were the comeback game, of course. 51-3 over the Raiders. The perfect game, using finger quotes, the perfect game against the New England Patriots, in which the Bills scored 7 touchdowns on 7 possessions. And the slump breaker against the Dolphins, week 1 of the 1980 season, in which the goalposts were torn down. Those were the top 4. Not going to tell you the order, but I was surprised. I thought number 1 was going to be a lot more landslidey than it was, but what it came down to was 1 vote. Of the 9-member panel, 5 of them voted for one game, 4 of them voted for the other game first, and the difference was 2 points in the out of a potential of 250 points. It came down to a difference of 2 points.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think the top 4 is solid. I'd imagine just about everybody's ballot had those 4 as the big 4, I would believe. And I'm pretty sure everybody's list had 1 and 2 as the top 2 in some order.
Number 5 was a surprise to me. Now, of course, this is me as a non-native Buffalonian. I moved to Buffalo in 2000, but I've covered this team for a long time, and I've immersed myself in the lore, and I know all these games. When I came up with the ballot for everybody to vote on, number 5 was a surprise to me. Like I didn't realize that significance there. It received 2 fourth place votes and a 5th, and then got enough. Oh, and a 3rd. It got a 3rd. Chris Parker voted it his 3rd most important game. I was surprised at that one. I will say it was a Super Bowl era game, but it was not one that really registered with me in terms of importance.
I think I had that 5th and maybe could have made an argument to put it slightly higher. I mean, that was a big deal. That's
You had it 8th.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Wait, what is number 5? Maybe I'm mistaking which game we're talking about here.
The AFC Championship
Okay.
game.
Oh, yeah.
Bills 10, Broncos 7.
Okay, now I'm curious what I put ahead of that.
John Elway throws a pick 6 to Carlton Bailey and gets
right.
knocked out of the game after 3 sacks and a fumble.
Yeah. My father was on the sideline for that game carrying holding the wires for cameras back then when they didn't have wireless cameras.
Oh, no kidding.
Yes, he was. Well, I think and this goes into my belief as to what should be the number one game. I think games at the stadium that sent the Bills to the Super Bowl have the highest stakes. And maybe, maybe it shouldn't be that simple, but being an AFC Championship game, uh, maybe should give more importance than a wild card
And
game,
you can
even
say
though,
what your vote was. We're not let's without saying who won it. You voted. Your number one game was 51-3 over the Raiders.
yes. And even though the comeback game deserves a number one spot, if that's, what the votes lead us to. And maybe outside of Buffalo with the being an NFL record and the historical significance and what people who aren't Bills fans or within the Bills culture recognize as the most memorable game, I think you could probably make that case as being one of the most memorable games in NFL history. I think if you're ranking greatest NFL games, the comeback game is going to be higher than the 51-3 game. But for Bills history, for Bills culture, for I think the greatest moment in that stadium, that 51-3 AFC Championship game in 1991, the 1990 season, a day or so after the Gulf War had started. Uh, the fact that the Bills got out to that early lead, they were winning 41-3 at halftime, and the entire second half was just 80,000 people celebrating the Bills' first Super Bowl appearance ever, and the culmination of that was, I think, the highest moment of that great era for Bills football. All of the great players played in that game, which is a little bit different than the comeback game when a few of the Bills' all-time greats, Jim Kelly and Cornelius Bennett, were injured in that game. And, it would probably it's 1A and 1B, and they probably both deserve to be number one. But I think people who lived in Buffalo and were watching the Bills in the early 90s, I would say most of us would probably put 51-3 over the comeback game, just because it was such a crowning achievement for that Bills team and just felt like they won the Super Bowl that day, even though they went off and lost the Super Bowl a week later. The way they dominated that game, it really looked like they couldn't be beat and they were going to beat whoever came out of the NFC. And, the NFC Championship game hadn't been played yet. And I think the 49ers were favored to win that game because Phil Simms was hurt and Jeff Hostetler was the quarterback. And it was still felt like the Bills were going to go on and beat the two-time defending champion San Francisco 49ers in the Super Bowl and stake their claim as the very best team in all of football. Didn't play out that way, but for that afternoon, it felt like the Bills had conquered the mountain of NFL football and done it at home in front of all their fans. And they had never been to the Super Bowl before. And Van Miller, what did he say? It took 25 years, but the Bills are finally in the Super Bowl. And for that to all happen live in front of Bills fans, the comeback game was not sold out and not shown on local television. I wonder if that's a factor. It was a wild card game. I feel like 51-3 is the ultimate moment in Bills history, even if the comeback game is a greater NFL achievement for the
Yeah,
Buffalo Bills.
I would always just assume that the comeback game would be the pick and that it was going to be unanimous or close to unanimous. And of course, I was very wrong. But that to me has always been like Buffalo's Super Bowl, the crowning achievement of triumph of especially maybe as time has gone by and you look at four straight Super Bowl losses, that was the game they won where they proved, their pluck and the fact that never say die. And it is kind of a game. It's a symbolic game that you can use for the Bills and their resilience and the fact that they will not be their relentlessness, even though in the end they may be denied, they are going to be fighting and they're going to be on their feet until the final bell. And I was wrong, obviously. Any other you had, and Joan, I know you got to get going here, but you said you had one that you had high that you thought maybe your vote got it on the list.
I just think an underappreciated moment in Bills history. I think people who are old enough to remember and do remember probably, and I'm actually not old enough to remember this, but I'm aware of it happening and soon became old enough to understand what it meant. Was I believe it was week 6, maybe it was week 7 in the 1987 season. The Bills had just traded for Cornelius Bennett earlier in that week. It was his first time playing for the Bills. They won at home against the Denver Broncos. Bennett, I think, had 2 sacks on John Elway. You know, the Broncos were the AFC champions the year before and the AFC champions in that season. And I think that was the kickoff of the Bills' great era that started in 1988. But it sort of bubbled into starting in 1987. That Bills team didn't make the playoffs, but if it wasn't for the strike games and things like that, probably was good enough to make the playoffs or would have made the playoffs in a 16-game season. And, it's similar to Jim Kelly's first game in 1986 with, I think, the anticipation of seeing this great player, Cornelius Bennett, make his debut for the Bills and join all these other uh, great players that the Bills had acquired in that mid-'80s era. But the Bills didn't win that game against the Jets in Jim Kelly's first game. And I think that they won the game and they beat another very good team. And Cornelius Bennett had such an impact on the game. And now maybe it felt like the defense was complete and could match Jim Kelly in this offense. And it took until the next season before they were a playoff team and a Super Bowl contending team. But I feel like it really did start with that trade and with that win. And that was a pivotal moment for Bills history.
Yeah, there was the Jim Kelly game, his debut. Or no, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one.
I think that's what makes this list fun, though, because that Jim Kelly game is a huge moment and feels like
That did
one of the
not make
most.
the list. That came in, and you did not vote for that. Or no, you did. That
Yeah,
was your 15th. You had it as number 15, 1986, Jim Kelly's debut. They lose to the Jets 28-24. But it was a big game for Jim Kelly. 20 of 33 for 292 and 3 touchdowns with no interceptions.
I think the way I perceived this list was trying to think. We don't have the hard data on this, but if we did, is what games or what moments within these games would have gotten the decibel level the highest? What popped the crowd the most? And if you were at that game, made you cheer the loudest or remember cheering the most? And I feel like both those games had those moments, and a lot of the games that I voted for, especially games I covered and was there for, and I recognized what got the fans up out of their seats and excited, and remembering that game weeks and months and years later, and feels like those two moments and the context behind them merited inclusion.
Well, please check out the list. We also had some of our panelists also gave their weirdest game or their oddball game. They gave a little vote. And in that, at the end, I put my favorite game. And my favorite game, which didn't make the list, was what I thought was one of the maybe one of the greatest plays anybody's ever seen. So I think then it becomes one of the greatest play, maybe the greatest play in the Ralphs history was Randall Cunningham scrambling through the end zone, almost getting sacked for a safety by Bruce Smith and just pulling some magician shit out of his rear and hitting Fred Barnett for a 95-yard touchdown. And the Bills still won that game 30-23 against the Eagles. That was back
Yeah.
in 1990. It did not
Maybe
make the list. Mark Gahn had that as his number 10 game, and
yeah.
it did not make the list because it didn't get enough love otherwise.
And that was a great Philadelphia Eagles team. They didn't make the Super Bowl, but within the regular season of that 1990 season, they were considered a peer of the Giants and the Redskins and the 49ers and the other great teams in the NFC, and considered maybe one of the favorites at that point in the middle of that season. And maybe, this Randall Cunningham play you're talking about, maybe the greatest individual play in stadium history.
right.
And
Here's
I
I
think
was just looking at big votes that didn't make the list. So was Mark Gahn's top 10 that didn't make the list? No. Here's one. Chris Parker's number 4 did not make the list. And that was week 2, 1991, Bills 52, Steelers 34, highest scoring game in stadium history. Jim Kelly throws for 363 and 6 touchdowns, 4 of them to Don Beebe. And Chris Parker had that way up there, and it didn't make the list. Didn't make the top 25.
I think one thing that might be missing in this list, but I don't know if it necessarily belongs, but it is great games that are great not because of the Bills. I think maybe something that some people might have voted for, I don't think it made the cut, was the Patriots winning 55-3 or whatever
The
that was
Patriots in
during
2007. Yeah, that was that was, and I said in my write-up when I put it on the ballot, I mean, it's like it wasn't necessarily a great game, but it was like you say you saw the Rolling Stones at
Yeah.
Rich Stadium or saw the Grateful Dead at Rich Stadium. That was that performance. Let me see if I can find my write up for that I put on the ballot. Um, in fact, that was kind of it.
I wasn't at that game, but I remember watching it on TV. That was a spectacle to see, and it was, I'm sure Bills fans wanted the Bills to win that game, but I believe it was almost more entertaining and more fun to watch the Patriots do what they did in that game than it would have been to see the Bills uh, beat the Patriots. I guess ending the
Yeah, week
Patriots' undefeated
11,
season would have
week
been
11 of
significant.
2007. Patriots 56, Bills 10. Less of a game and more like saying you saw the Rolling Stones or the Grateful Dead at Rich Stadium. Tom Brady completes 31 of 39 for 373 yards and 5 touchdowns, 4 of them to Randy Moss by halftime.
Mhm.
And that received 2 votes. Bulldog had it as his number 11 game, and John Morrow had it as his number 17 game
Yeah.
because of the spectacle. I think
Yeah.
if I were on the panel, that would have gotten one of my votes. I don't know where I would have put it because I did not go through the process of where everything would be, but that would have that would have been in my top 25 because you have to set aside the fact that it was a shit game for the Bills. And that's why I had so many members on the panel. It's up to everybody individually to say what greatness
Yeah.
is. And for a game, and a lot of people, as you'd expect, leaned towards a Bills victory.
Yeah. And seeing that team live, it's like seeing the 96 Bulls or the 86 Celtics or the 85 Bears or something like that, live in Buffalo. Speaking of the Patriots, if I could just kind of a small spoiler, people who read your article will notice I made comments on 2 wins the Bills had against the Patriots, and there are only 2 proper wins against Tom Brady. And in conversation with you, I believe I voted these games higher than just about everybody else on the panel. But uh, the Lawyer Malloy game, beating them 31-0 in the 2003 season opener, and then beating the Patriots in 2011 with Ryan Fitzpatrick and Stevie Johnson and Fred Jackson and the no-name Bills, as they were called that
It's
season,
magic.
and how big of a deal that was. And I remember, Van Miller standing up in the press box and announcing was it Ryan Lindell kicking the game-winning field
Yes.
goal, and I remember them lowering the goalpost because they knew that the fans would try to run out on the field and tear down the goalpost if they didn't, and the fans staying in the crowd singing "Sweet Caroline." And I wrote a column for the Niagara Gazette that day about, maybe this is a bit of a cliche, but the headline was "Good times never felt so good." That was that post-game celebration. I was covering the game, but watching it and seeing the Bills fans and knowing the Bills fans, that felt like, it was week 3, but that really felt like they won a championship or that they should give that team some sort of ring for beating the Patriots and ending that losing streak and doing that at home. And,
It was
I
such
think,
a likable team. They had so many overachievers, cast-offs from other teams, undrafted people, like Ryan Fitzpatrick and Fred Jackson and Stevie Johnson, who was whatever he was, a 6th or 7th round pick. And just all along the offensive line, like everybody was
mm,
just a retread from somewhere
yeah,
else. And Chan Gailey was likable,
yep.
especially after Dick Duran. Yeah, that was a team that was easy to embrace.
And the Patriots were unlikable at that
Scott
time.
Chandler off waivers,
Yeah,
David
right.
Nelson, who were the receivers? The kid from St. Joe's.
Naaman
Uh,
Roosevelt was on
yeah,
that team.
Naaman
Yep.
Roosevelt and
Donald Jones was
Donald
on that
Jones.
team. Yep.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
and there were a couple other losses that I thought might get some run. The
yeah.
Vikings Bills overtime game, that was, I mean, it was a collapse, but that was the game where Justin
Yeah.
Jefferson would make another of the plays that would be up there with Randall Cunningham and talking about the greatest plays ever made at that stadium. That catch that he made in that loss to the Vikings a couple of years ago,
Yeah.
and then there were a couple others, but
Yeah.
anyways,
Both of those games put the Bills on the cover of Sports Illustrated, which
the 2
has
games you're
happened.
talking about, yeah, the 2
Yeah.
Patriots games, and they
In
were
other
both pick
instances.
sixes of Tom Brady.
Yeah. Um,
Sam
right.
Jones or Sam
Sam
Adams
Adams. Yeah.
and
Drayton
Drayton
Florence.
Florence, right?
Yeah. And then we'll give a little Easter egg here for people who are listening all the way to the end of this podcast. My oddball contribution was another game against the Patriots. I don't know if they won. Actually, they would have lost this game. But so my name is appearing in the New York Times to state that I gotta find it now. Jonah Bronstein's one to remember. 2016 Week 8, Patriots 41, Bills 25. The first sex toy throw.
That story, which is the return of the dildo that I wrote, now has a New York Times URL. So that was back in the day when we were a little less censored than we are when we're at the New York Times. But when the New York Times bought The Athletic and absorbed all our content, it's an unfortunate word there when you're talking about dildos. But when they absorbed all our content, they just kept it as is. So whatever F bombs or when we were in our Rolling Stone era of cover, anything goes uncensored. Anyways,
This is a topical thing now that, these toys are being thrown at WNBA games, and I believe an NFL preseason game last week that happened. Bills
good
fans
times never
always
felt
ahead of
so
the
good.
curve.
All right, Jonah, thank you for this. And thank you everybody out there for checking out Tim Graham and Friends, brought to you by CTBK, CPAs and Business Consultants. Again, like us, subscribe, favorite us, rate us, comment, do all the things, engage, and we enjoy that. We like we love the comments. I get an alert every time there's a comment, and I'll jump in there and write back. I can't thank you enough for giving us your time. And please check out the top 25 games at the Ralph rankings that is at The Athletic today.
The financial needs of a business go beyond tax and attest services. That's why CTBK goes beyond accounting services and offers outsourced solutions through their affiliation with CFO Solutions Plus. These additional services allow clients to focus on their operational and long-term strategic goals. Trust CTBK's outsourced solutions to provide cost-effective, value-added financial services tailored to your company's needs. Call CTBK at 716-630-2400. Again, 716-630-2400. Or go to ctbk.com to learn more about CTBK's outsourced solutions.